Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our call today. We are talking about leveraging federal funds for our communities across Massachusetts. My name is Erica Gaitán. I'm a member of the Health Resources in Action team. We are a public health institute in Massachusetts. We're co-sponsoring this event with the Northern Middlesex Council of Governments. So again, thank you for taking the time to be here today. We have a great agenda for you today, but before we get started, I did want to go through a couple of housekeeping items. Many of us are familiar with Zoom by now, but I do want to point out just a couple of features. We're asking that folks remain muted if possible during this session. There will be a time for Q&A, so if anything comes up, you can unmute then. But in the meantime, we really encourage you to use the chat box. Feel free to introduce yourself now, drop your name, where you live. And throughout the webinar, we encourage you to drop any questions you have there. And a document will be sent out post-webinar for folks with any questions that came up during today's call. Our meeting today will be recorded and will be available at a later date on our website for folks who weren't able to join. And if you have any tech issues, please chat directly to my colleague, Lex. Lex, can you give us a wave? Lex Vasquez will be troubleshooting the chat box if anything comes up from a tech standpoint. We have interpretation available today. So there's an interpretation channel at the bottom of your screen if you would like to join in our Spanish channel. We have Emily, who's interpreting in that Spanish channel, and Hussein are doing our ASL translation. So thank you all so much for language accessibility. And if you want to jump in and out of those channels, please feel free to do so. So a quick roadmap. After our housekeeping items, Jennifer Reid, our Executive Director from the Northern Middlesex Council of Governments, will do some grounding and welcoming to this event. Then we'll have Heath Bailey, who will do our overview of just some of the federal funding and what's coming down the pike in Massachusetts and what we're seeing. We'll transition to some examples in practice, really thinking about how towns and municipalities are thinking about their federal funding, with an example from the towns of Brookline and Westford. And then lastly, we'll open it up for a discussion for a community panel to hear from community groups, advocates, activists, to hear how they're really thinking about the needs in their community and how they're advocating for these federal funds at the local level. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jenny Reid to get us started.
Thank you so much, Erica. Really appreciate this opportunity. I'm Jennifer Reid. I'm the Executive Director of the Northern Middlesex Council of Governments. And I'm going to just quickly walk through who we are. We are the regional planning agency for 9 communities. And as the regional planning agency, we are, can you go to the next slide, please? We are one of 13 RPAs across the Commonwealth. We are a public agency. We're governed by an 18-member policy board. It's comprised of local elected and appointed officials from our 9 communities. Our goal as a regional planning agency is to increase the capacity of municipalities and to foster regional cooperation and coordination. We have a 14-member staff. We provide comprehensive planning services to all of our communities. Most of our work is local, but we also work, of course, at the regional level on transportation, economic development, land use, housing, environmental protection, and more. Next slide, please. We have technical staff who work directly for the Northern Middlesex Metropolitan Planning Organization. That is the technical component for our transportation planning services. We work under a contract with MassDOT and the Lowell Regional Transit Authority. We're also the partner to the Economic Development Administration, or the EDA, as well as the Executive Office of Housing and Economic Development and local communities to help address housing and economic development issues at the regional level as well as at a community level. We're funded in part by municipal assessments, federal transportation and economic development dollars, state grants, local fees for services, and special assessments. Next slide, please. Some of our selected current projects and activities include things like helping our communities with green communities planning, facilitating the Northern Middlesex Stormwater Collaborative, working with our communities to comply with the new Mass General Law Section 3A under the Zoning Act, or MBTA communities requirement. And we're also working on a regional transportation plan to increase mode shift throughout our region. Next slide. And now, oh, sorry. Now, okay. So now I'm going to actually transition and introduce our Senator, Edward Markey. The Senator has been a leader when it comes to ARPA and many federal dollars that are coming to our Commonwealth. And we're really tremendously excited and appreciate this opportunity to both introduce him and to welcome him to our region. He has some remarks to provide. I want to say that the important part of this session, and I hope what everybody takes away from it, is that it's very important to center equity and engage communities as part of our decision-making processes, particularly in relationship to these monumental funding opportunities. Some of them we've seen so far and we're going to hear about, but there's so much more to come. These opportunities can position our communities for success, help to address critical issues, and to leverage additional funding and resources. And by resources, I don't just mean more dollars, I mean people being engaged in processes to take action and move things forward. So with that, I'd love to introduce our Senator, Edward Markey.
Good afternoon, everyone. My deep thanks to Erica, Jenny, and the teams at the Northern Middlesex Council of Governments and Health Resources in action for organizing this important conversation today. It's just so important. It's my job in Washington to fight to ensure that the people of Massachusetts receive every single dollar of federal funding available to us. But securing that funding raises a simple but profoundly important question. How do we spend that money? Government budgets are moral documents. How we allocate our money, especially in a state as rich in resources and brain power as Massachusetts, is how we decide what kind of a society, what kind of a community we want to live in, and who is centered in that community. Who do we see? It is critical that we approach these decisions with justice in mind, clear-eyed about who our choices affect. They affect the local mom and pop's shop, deciding whether they can afford to keep their doors open. It's as simple as that. They affect commuters, watching their travel time increase, wondering how they'll get to work or school on time. It's as simple as that. They affect workers and seniors, choosing between paying medical debt or the rent, between filling prescriptions or the fridge, or between getting a medical test or heating oil. It's as simple as that. For us as activists and civil servants, each of these choices presents a collective call to action. Together, we must elevate the voices of people who are most disadvantaged in our system and take bold and consistent steps to create communities that provide full economic and social opportunity to every person, no matter their race, their gender, their age, or their income. That is why I am grateful for this discussion about how we can leverage recent landmark federal legislation to fight for justice in our communities and ensure that those most harmed by the pandemic, by inadequate infrastructure, by environmental devastation, see the benefits of these funds. Taken together, the American Rescue Plan, the bipartisan infrastructure law, and the Inflation Reduction Act represent an historic investment in an equitable recovery from COVID-19 and a more just and sustainable future for everyone. The American Rescue Plan has distributed an estimated $113 billion to Massachusetts, primarily through 4 mechanisms. First, the American Rescue Plan distributed billions in direct aid to Massachusetts residents, to Massachusetts businesses, to Massachusetts nonprofit organizations, including $7.8 billion for enhanced unemployment benefits and $1 billion in aid for more than 2,500 restaurants across the state of Massachusetts to keep them afloat. And second, the American Rescue Plan also directed billions in targeted funding to the state for distribution. That was critical because it included more than $450 million in rental assistance, $1 billion in transit agency funding, more than $2.5 billion for education funding, and $65 million for substance abuse and mental health services through block grants during this crisis. Third, the American Rescue Plan directed $8.7 billion to Massachusetts through the state and through local fiscal recovery funds, including $3.4 billion for municipal and county governments and $5.3 billion for state fiscal recovery. So important. And fourth, the rescue plan delivered an additional $187 million in funds for Massachusetts Home Energy Assistance Program for low-income residents, more than doubling our state's usual funding for this life-saving program. Just so important. The American Rescue Plan has served as a life raft for countless families, small business owners, and essential workers. But that was not the end of our work. Through the bipartisan infrastructure law, the Commonwealth is also poised to receive more than $9 billion over the next 5 years. And that funding will go to road improvements, replacing and repairing bridges, supporting the MBTA, making communities safer and more accessible for bicyclists and pedestrians, drinking water and wastewater management, expanding broadband across our state, and deploying electric vehicle charging stations. This is just absolutely historic. But there's also billions more that could come our way through competitive grant programs for once-in-a-generation projects like East-West Rail or West-East Rail, depending upon your perspective, and replacing the Cape Cod bridges, absolutely necessary. And finally, in August of this year, I was proud to have helped pass the Inflation Reduction Act, the single largest investment in climate justice and environmental protection in our nation's entire history, or any other nation in the world. And I'm proud to say that the Inflation Reduction Act will provide Massachusetts with access to ultimately billions of dollars, $60 billion in environmental justice investments. We're going to get a big part of that. That's going to start to right the wrongs wrought by polluters in our most vulnerable communities, Springfield, Worcester, Lawrence, Chelsea, but all across the state. There's another program for $27 billion for a climate bank to give vulnerable communities access to capital to invest in locally led clean energy projects all across Massachusetts and our country. There's also $500 million for the Defense Production Act funding, which will ensure we have robust domestic supply chains to install heat pumps in buildings across the country and unleash clean energy technologies everywhere. So this is historic. Another $150 million in funding to address urban heat islands, extreme heat, and community air monitoring. Chelsea, Lawrence, Springfield, you name it. And there's so much more that's in this bill. Our work is far from over, but I have faith that this recent federal legislation represents a critical step forward towards equity in this country. Black, brown, immigrant communities are going to be seen, and my office stands ready to help you navigate these federal opportunities. And I encourage you to contact my team with any questions you may have about your community, how you can access such historic investments. There's billions of dollars here. Let us help you in my office to gain access to that money. I just want to thank all of you for all the work you're doing, not just for making all this a reality for our Commonwealth, but being a model for the rest of the country. You are special people. You understand that all of this has the moral imperative of the Civil Rights Act. It has the vision of President Kennedy's moonshot, but we have to do it here on Earth. And finally, seeing the communities here who have been most adversely affected historically. let's get to work. Let's get this all done. There's billions of dollars. I want to partner with you to make sure that Massachusetts is able to take full advantage of these historic pieces of legislation. Thanks so much for all of the great work you do.
Wonderful. What an incredible and exciting time. I am pumped when I hear that presentation. It is so wonderful to hear from our senator providing those remarks. Thank you so much. Also, thank you to his staff and team for bringing him here with us today and sharing this amazing news and information. There's so much work to do, and we're only just getting started. We're also delighted to be able to introduce Heath Faley, the Assistant Secretary for Federal Funds of the Executive and the Executive Office for Administration and Finance of the state. He is going to walk us through really a high-level overview of ARPA, but also to explain a little bit more to us the eligible uses of the funding and how municipalities are already working towards reporting out their milestones and progress, outcomes, successes, and some creative approaches that are possible through this funding source. Again, I'm really excited about this, and I'm looking forward to hearing your questions if you have any once we get there. So thank you, and I'm going to turn it over to Heath.
Well, thanks very much, Jennifer, and thanks to everybody for being on the webinar this afternoon. Happy to be with you all. My name is Heath Foley. I'm an Assistant Secretary at the Executive Office for Administration and Finance. ANF is the financial management and planning agency for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And as the senator highlighted in his remarks, the relationship between the federal government and states has really been sort of dramatically redefined over the course of the last 3 years since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so it makes sense as we think about both sort of what's the nature of that redefined relationship. I'll talk about the federal funds, the federal grant programs that have been or are available to communities across the Commonwealth. As a result of this redefinition of that relationship, and then use that as a jumping off point to talk about sort of the things that travel with that, right? Sort of a robust stakeholder engagement process to answer questions like, the sort of the what and how questions. How are we going to deploy these funds, on what projects or programs are we going to spend the dollars? And so an external, a robust stakeholder engagement process is important to that sort of how and what. And also the, in addition to the sort of stakeholder engagement, also thinking about the who and where do those dollars go, and thinking about how to distribute those dollars in a fair and equitable way. So most of my presentation, I would say, is a summary of the resources that are available, either have been or are available. And then I think that will really set up the conversation about how, what, who, and where those dollars go. And I know that's the rest of the program today. So as we jump into the presentation, sort of picking up where the senator left off, there've really been sort of three COVID-related pieces of federal legislation that have steered significant resources to the Commonwealth over the course of the last 2+ years at this point. By our count, about $116 billion in total COVID-related federal assistance in Massachusetts. The CARES Act from March of 2020, and then ARPA passed in March of 2021 are sort of the two most notable pieces of legislation. Smaller, less well known, but underappreciated in a lot of ways is SARISA, which was in December of 2020. Really, those form sort of the sort of key pillars of the federal COVID response. And as we and there's sort of several different flavors of that. There's the direct assistance, direct aid directly to beneficiaries. So this is federal programs and projects that steered money to Massachusetts, businesses, families, individuals, etc. Targeted assistance, so typically flows through the Commonwealth, but then the federal government describes for us exactly, sort of the policy areas of the programs through which those funds should go out. And then there's a thinner slice at the top there of flexible aid, in which the Commonwealth or the state has had, the state or local governments have had some measure of discretion about where and how to deploy those funds. And so as we flip to the next slide, try to break that out in a little bit more detail. $63 billion in direct aid, of that 116, a little over half. Targeted aid, $41 billion, and then something like $11 billion in flexible aid, for which state or local governments have some ability to direct, though as with most federal resources, there are still pretty significant federal rules and regulations that apply. And so, as we flip to the next slide, this comes in sort of several different paths into the state. Sort of narrowing in on the portions of the resources that flowed through state or local government in Massachusetts. Sort of several different types of targeted aid. So COVID-related unemployment insurance benefits, for example, sort of passed through the Commonwealth, but again, policy set at the federal level and then deployed through state government. Many of the COVID-19 testing, vaccination programs, assistance for early child care providers. These are federal grants that the sort of the method, or the dollars and the method for distributing those are articulated at the federal level, and then state agencies act as sort of the front door for those resources in the Commonwealth. And then reimbursement programs. So the Commonwealth incurred costs in the first instance and then gets reimbursed by the federal government after. The Federal Emergency Management Agency's Public Assistance Grant Program, FEMA PA, pre-COVID was really sort of focused on hurricanes and tornadoes and snowstorms and floods and that sort of thing. But during the COVID period has really transformed that program to provide reimbursement for eligible costs. And then the one that sort of consumes most of the focus and attention is the relatively flexible discretionary aid provided through the Coronavirus Relief Fund, through the CARES Act, and then the State Fiscal Recovery Fund. I want to talk most of the time today about the State Fiscal Recovery Fund and the Local Fiscal Recovery Fund. These were created in the American Rescue Plan Act, ARPA, $350 billion in total across the country. In Massachusetts, that translated to $5.3 billion for the state, and then about $3.4 billion for counties, cities, and towns across the Commonwealth. A bit of detail on the slide there about the timeline that the state has gone through, starting all the way back in June of 2021, when the Massachusetts General Court made these dollars subject to appropriation. So for the $5.3 billion, the governor and the legislature have worked together to identify spending priorities, projects and programs, and then the legislature has appropriated those dollars. So that appropriations process has occurred over sort of two rounds. The first round was back in December of 2021, and then the second round actually just happened a few weeks ago. Legislation, economic development bill passed. That's sort of largely many of the sort of expansion initiatives that are in that legislation funded by this ARPA dollars. So we're at the state level, we're at the point where the the federal dollars are sort of fully allocated, sort of the projects and programs for that those dollars will support have been identified. But the sort of the next critical step is the program design and implementation phase. And so I think our conversation about stakeholder engagement and then a fair and equitable distribution really fit in, are very well timed for those reasons. So big picture, the fiscal recovery funds at both the state and local levels are governed by the same sort of statutory framework at the federal level, and then also the same rules and regulations that apply. The statute articulates 4 eligible use categories: responding to the public health emergency related to COVID or addressing negative economic impacts, providing premium pay to employees that worked in person during the public health emergency, providing government services to the extent of the reduction in revenue calculated due to COVID-19, and investments in water, sewer, or broadband infrastructure. In terms of timing, and this is this is really a sort of a key feature, is that the funds need to be obligated, so committed to spend by December 31st, 2024, and then need to be fully spent, sort of checks out the door by December 31st, 2026. For many programs, this timeline works fine. But certainly as people contemplate capital projects, those water, sewer, broadband infrastructure, other sort of projects that require construction in particular, this timeline, even though it seems like sort of a pretty long time, can actually get pretty constrained when you start to think about all the steps that have to happen in order to make, in particular physical infrastructure, but even some programs can be constrained by those time limits that are imposed by the legislation. And so on the next slide, after these, again, those are sort of the eligible uses. Also highlighting, today, or to this point in the presentation, I've spoken mostly about the state fiscal recovery funds, those controlled by the Commonwealth, but counties, cities, and towns in Massachusetts have received funding directly from the federal government. Again, about $3.4 billion. Again, same rules. For the local fiscal recovery fund, those resources were distributed in sort of 2 tranches. Sort of 50% went out over the course of the summer of 2021 last year, and then the second tranche has gone out over this past summer, so that by September of this year, all of the local fiscal recovery fund dollars have been distributed to counties, cities, and towns. And important to note that on those resources, those local fiscal recovery fund resources, the responsibility for administering those dollars is exclusively at the local level. So the Commonwealth has no role in directing those dollars, administering those dollars, or tracking their use. On the next slide, wanted to touch on the infrastructure law, bipartisan infrastructure law that passed in November last year, IIJA or bill. Again, this is another sort of major investment of federal resources in the Commonwealth and states across the country. It is both a mix of a reauthorization of transportation funding programs, grant programs that were already in place, sort of reauthorizing and extending those programs. It adds dollars to many of those existing federal transportation programs, and then creates new programs, new grant opportunities on top of those resources, and really sort of in 4 big buckets. Transportation infrastructure is sort of the single largest one. Water and sewer projects through the state's 2 revolving funds, and investments in sort of climate resiliency, power grid investments, and then also broadband infrastructure. Those are really sort of the 4 pillars of the infrastructure bill. I would say it's somewhat more difficult to talk about the bipartisan infrastructure law bill than it is to talk about ARPA, for example, those fiscal recovery fund dollars, because the fiscal recovery fund is one grant program. Has one set of rules, one set of eligible use guidelines, etc. Whereas bill is sort of a package. It's a bundle of federal programs, each that have their own rules and regulations, their own calendar for when those resources will be deployed, and a much longer time frame. This really bill authorizes spending over the course of the next decade. So it can be much more difficult to sort of pin down. Somebody says, well, we're getting funding through the infrastructure bill. What that means is sort of more gray in this context than it is in some of the others. And so wrapping up, on the next slide, again, just those four big buckets. And then the final slide is I wanted to sort of set up the rest of the conversation with a couple of points about the Commonwealth's approach to stakeholder engagement and to considering equity as a factor in deploying the funds. So first on stakeholder engagement, the legislature, as I talked about, the legislature and the governor have been responsible for working together to appropriate the state fiscal recovery fund dollars. The legislature held a set of public hearings on sort of proposed uses for these funds over the course of the summer of 2021, summer and fall of 2021. I think there were 8 or 9 public hearings on the topic, and then obviously has been sort of the subject of a great deal of consideration over that time. And then on the equity front, one of the things that the legislature created was the Federal Equity and Accountability Review Commission or panel. This panel is responsible for this panel is responsible for articulating goals. Who and where are the funds distributed? Articulating those goals, sort of giving us sort of a compared to what, and then they're responsible for collecting and publishing data that measure how well we're achieving those goals, and then recommending strategies to improve spending allocation. And I would say that this is, so it gives us a compared to what, it collects and publishes the data and then makes those recommendations. The public comment period for the equity panel is still ongoing, so I would encourage folks to take a look at that. All of the materials associated with the equity panel are available on the ANF website, mass.gov/federal funds, mass.gov/federal funds. So I'd encourage people to take a look at the work that the equity panel has done. And I would say the equity panel's work is really focused on the fiscal recovery fund, but I actually think the value will stretch well on into the future, both for the infrastructure bill, Inflation Reduction Act, and some of the other federal legislation that will steer resources to the Commonwealth over the course of the next several years. So with that, I'll turn it back over to, I'm not sure who, Jennifer or Erica, to sort of kick off the next segment of the panel.
Yeah, Heath, hi, this is Ben Wood with Health Resources
Hi, Ben.
Action. How you doing? There's one question in the chat, and we have time for just one question, so it works out really well. The question is, direct administration is an allowable use. How would a city or town obligate the salary for post December 31st, 2024 to finish the administration?
Yeah, so I'm going to give you 2 answers there. So the first answer is that payroll is the typical practice is that payroll is obligated when it's spent, and so our sort of current read of the law is that administration costs after 12/31/24 are not eligible to be covered by the grant. So that's sort of point 1. But point 2 is also, this is an issue that has been flagged repeatedly for the federal grant making agency, the U.S. Department of Treasury. And so we know that they are aware of this issue, right? This sort of what do you do about calendar year 25 and calendar year 26? And so I think there's at least some hope that Treasury will address the issue in updated or forthcoming guidance. But at current I think operating expectation should be that payroll is obligated when it's spent, and therefore 12/31/2024 should be viewed as the time after which you need to identify a non fiscal recovery fund source for those costs.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Heath.
Very
Thanks for
good.
that great overview and giving us the sense of the rules of the road. Going to pass it back over to Jenny to kick off the next section.
Excellent. Thank you, Heath, and thank you, Ben. Appreciated that. So helpful to hear all of the details about how these things get run, both at the state level and locally. It's sort of mind-boggling how it all works behind the scenes, and then also how that translates locally, which is really what this next section is about. And we're going to hear two examples. I've had the pleasure with working with both of them right now. Currently, I work with Miriam, who is a select board member for the town of Brookline. I am also on the committee, which is an ARPA review committee with her. So have directly worked on this particular topic, and with Anita, who is a select board member in the town of Westford. And she's also the vice chair of NIMCOG. And I'm so pleased to have both of them here with us today to share the community perspective and to help get all of you inspired to learn more about some of the challenges, but also the successes that they've had in working with ARPA locally, and also how that might translate to other things that they're working on or considering at the local level. So with that, I'm going to, I think, start with Miriam.
Great. Hi, thank you so much, Jenny. And it's been a real pleasure working with you. I feel so lucky we have this ARPA review committee, and it's filled with, there's 5 of us and everyone is subject matter expert. And I'm so thankful that there are people out there who are much smarter than I am to review some of the grants that we're getting. So a little bit about myself. My name is Miriam Ashkenazi. I'm a retired emergency medicine physician. I did global humanitarian response for 18 years. Then I decided it would be a good idea to go back to school. I got a master's in public administration, and now I run a program at the Harvard Kennedy School called the Institutional Anti-Racism and Accountability Project. And in my free time, I'm a select board member for the town of Brookline, which for those of you who don't know, is essentially a volunteer position. And I got tapped to head the ARPA, to co-chair the ARPA review committee. And to say that we are building the plane while we are flying it is the most perfect description. The 2 things I was committed to as a select board member was transparency and community engagement. And what I would say to people is, you may not agree with where we end up in terms of how we spend the money, but you're going to know how we got there. And actually, I will say that engaging the community and then having a really fully transparent process, the feedback at the end was people were really, even again, if they didn't agree with how we got there, they at least understood it. And so that was really helpful. What we ended up doing was having this committee. We opened up the grant process to the community. So we made one grant process. If you were and I'll give a great example, the Department of Public Works for the town, and you wanted ARPA funds, you had to write a grant and you had to submit it through the same grant process that the Brookline Community Foundation did, or Brookline Mental Health Center, or any other community organization that wanted ARPA funds. And we did this after we had a very robust community engagement process. So we actually took some funds, we hired the Brookline Community Foundation, and they did a really expansive community engagement process, going to the community, meeting with people, convening groups, and saying, hey, and doing a survey and saying, hey, what's important to us as a community, as Brookline, where should we be prioritizing this money within, of course, the allowable uses. And that was really helpful. And, really COVID vulnerable populations, COVID affected and vulnerable populations was by far where folks really wanted emphasis, followed by housing, affordable housing, public health, and then, transportation. And so that actually really gave us a framing as we went in as a committee. Here's where the community wanted these funds spent. And then we had 80 grants asking for a total of $180 million. And we had about $42 million. What we decided to do was do it into two different phases. So phase one, because we figured we'd make mistakes and we could learn from them and then make those adjustments for phase two, which is exactly what has happened. And we're just now starting phase two. And so I would say about half the grants went into municipal coffers, to DPW, to the library, to town government offices. But half of that money went to, or maybe a little under half, went to community groups. And I can talk later about some of the challenges of that. But I think it was, for us, it was taking that community input and taking it a step further and actually putting the money in the hands of the community to be able to use. I think is that pretty good?
That's great. Yeah, great introduction. And I'll hand it over to Anita.
Great, thank you so much. My name is Anita Tonakarngwen. As Jenny mentioned, I'm a select board member in Westford. I joined during COVID. This is my first term, so it was a really interesting way to kind of start this work. Westford is about 25,000 people, and we received $7.4 million in ARPA funds. And to date, we've allocated about 4.2 million of that. So we've got another 3 million to go. And it's been really interesting to hear Miriam, her experience in Brookline so far, because there were definitely some synergies in what we did in Westford as well. We had two different phases. I think that's mostly based off of when the funds were being received by the town, but we also had sort of a streamlined process around that one single process that everyone had to complete in order to request funds. And we had a form that we submitted to or shared with all of our town committees, all of our town partners, and that really was to help us understand what are those needs in the community. We did do presentations for the community, and we didn't have an ARPA committee though. We are a smaller town, and so a lot of that was just kind of held within the select board and through this form that was distributed. So to get that gauge of ideas and understanding of the different ARPA funds, we sent around the form, which included information or asked for information related to what that project was, what the budget was, its impact or our relationship to COVID. They had to categorize those requests based on expenditure categories as, kind of in line with the ARPA guidelines. And we really wanted to make sure that we reached as many people as possible. But I think something that was helpful for us kind of leading up to this process, which is kind of like weird for me to say it now, but there were just so many things kind of coming down the pike that we were able to focus on using ARPA funds that were not originally part of, that wouldn't have been part of the capital planning, for example, or our typical budget season. So we had a task force already in place related to safety and town school safety task force. And we had a lot of mental health needs that kind of arise from that. And we were able to kind of channel ARPA funds to address some of the needs that we already knew were kind of coming down the pike. But sorry, to go back to the form for a second, something that we did also take a look at was just to kind of maximize what all of those funding streams that were coming into the town. I felt like we were inundated with funds and we almost didn't have an opportunity to spend it all as quickly as we would need to follow the timelines. But I think I'll pause there for a little bit because I know we are going to go more into some questions there, but I just wanted to also say thank you to NIMCOG and Health Resources in Action for bringing us all together, because I've been very hungry for sharing, I think, with our peers about how to kind of play out the ARPA funds.
That's great. I have a question, I think, for Miriam first, which is maybe just if you could talk a little bit more about the process that Brookline went through to center equity and even working with the community foundation locally, just an overview of how that worked and ways that we could improve that process or improve upon the process.
Yeah, I would say it's been a challenge, even with a committee who really, I think, front and center had equity as one of our priorities right from the start, which has been really interesting, right? So we have 5 subject matter experts, and one of our subject matter experts is race equity, and it wasn't me. I mean, I was the public health person, so which was actually good. We all had that race equity lens on, but we had one person in particular whose job was really to kind of continually raise the flag and say, hey, are we thinking about it this way? Are we thinking about it this way? And when what we did was we had these grants and we created we created a scoring sheet. And we tried to build into the points for the scoring sheet higher scores for grants that addressed equity in ways that we wanted. So reaching vulnerable populations, reaching low income COVID affected populations. So you would automatically, your grant would get higher score if you were addressing those issues. Even with that, I will say that once things started to get into practice, we found we just still weren't reaching the communities we wanted to. And so we've had several meetings since then, very specifically to figure out what we needed to change in order to do that. And we've revamped the entire grant writing, the grant application and scoring sheet for this second phase based on that. And the other thing we've done is we're going to be doing site visits, see if what we're actually reading is actually happening in practice. And I will say we found some online resources. What's interesting is I know Heath referenced that federal government equity resource. We didn't use it. I didn't even know about it. Sorry, Heath. But we found some other really great ARPA specific race equity online resources that we reference when rewriting and redoing some of the grant application. But I think it's a real challenge because, when you're talking about folks who are just working every day to make ends meet, this is an extra thing to ask. And so you have to really work hard to go out and meet that need without adding to the ask.
Yes, definitely. And I should note that each of you have completely different amounts of ARPA funds to work with and program. So that is an important point. And while, Brookline has millions of dollars, Anita, in your case, you have a little less to work with, but still for the town of Westford, it's a lot of money to think about and program. Can you talk a little bit about the process that was used or something that you might do differently about getting the word out about the opportunity?
Yeah, actually, I love that idea that Miriam just shared about revisiting the process and how to make it more equitable, because we are kind of starting our next phase. We had a rolling submission of the requests coming in through the grant process that we had in place. And I guess before I go back to that, I just wanted to also kind of mention, kind of as I referenced earlier, about how there were initiatives that were already in place within the town related to mental health, mental wellness, opioid use that I feel like really COVID just exacerbated, right? It just exploded under COVID. So we really were able to, first we immediately, address anything COVID related, pandemic related, first responders related testing. And then after that, we were like, okay, how do we reach those vulnerable populations or COVID impacted populations? And we created a position for a community wellness coordinator. It's an 18-month position, and we know, this is one-time use funds, but it was something we felt like there were needs that needed to be addressed immediately. We also created a contract for a mobile mental health clinician, because a lot of folks weren't able to access mental health services. It's just there's such a need out there right now, especially. When we also provided direct support to residents. So it's like rental, mortgage, and utility assistance, mental health co-payments for people who might not be able to pay for those co-payments, after school care and summer camp for families, for low-income families. And we also supported our schools de-escalation training for elementary principal aides and our PEG cable access TV partners, right? Kind of thinking about the expanded virtual landscape that we have now because of COVID, and how to make sure that they're able to be successful in helping to make sure that all of our meetings stay viewable. But I think, kind of going back to your question, Jen, about lessons learned or things that we could change, I think I'm really proud that we were able to kind of quickly move on those needs related to mental health, because those were things that we had already identified, and we were trying to figure out how we would be able to fund those through the regular budget season. And then also, I think there's definitely an opportunity, though, to think about equity and who we're not reaching. And we might not have an ARPA committee, but if there's a different way about how we can reach people, I'm definitely going to be thinking through that more with my select board colleagues.
Miriam, go ahead.
So what I think is interesting, if you don't mind me jumping in, is Anita, is that a lot of those, we funded a lot of similar initiatives. Mental health was a big piece. What this segues into something which I did want to say at some point today, which is one of the things we're struggling with is actually summer camp for low-income families, because we've come across this barrier of the public benefits test. And it's interesting. And this is where I think the thing that we didn't think about, we kind of got this directive, the federal government and everybody, community engagement. Yes. And we were already there. We were like, yes, we want to have lots of community engagement. But the reality is when you try to take it from a community engagement, from people sitting at the table and talking, to actually putting money in the hands of community members to do the programming, you come up across all of these roadblocks. I mean, forget the federal reporting guidelines, the public benefits test, the MOU for our community foundations, it's like 7 pages of legalese. And getting around all of that to get the money actually into communities and not being spent solely by the municipal bodies has been a really unexpected challenge. So I just had to say that. We're also doing utilities. I love that. I was like, oh yeah, we're doing that too.
It's nice having the validation, even from Senator Markey, of like how different ways to spend. I'm like, okay, we're on the right track. But
Except I think there's this real disconnect about how they say they want you to spend the money, but then how you're actually allowed to spend the money. I thought in Heath's slide, he had a great slide. It said the aid is, quote, flexible, end quote. And I was just like, that's right. Flexible in quotes.
Well, we have about 6 more minutes left. So maybe for each of you, just a little sort of summary, synopsis, and any additional lessons learned that you'd like to share with the group. Because I think what we've been talking about is sort of this, a little bit of the inside piece. We're like what the municipalities do sometimes is sort of like a bit of an inside game where we're trying to engage the community, but we're going to hear the community panel, and that's going to be a little more about how advocates and activists help to encourage municipalities to think about and look at this opportunity a little bit differently. So with that, either Miriam or Anita, do you want to summarize?
You want to go first, Anita? I've been talking a lot.
Well, I guess I would just say that as Miriam kind of opened up, it was very much like flying the plane and building it at the same time, just because we've never gone through this process before. And then just the fact that, we didn't need finance committee to kind of like check what we're doing. It felt very kind of scary. I'm like, gosh, we have a lot of power right now. Are we making the right decisions? And we did also try to be transparent. We wanted to make sure as many people knew as possible about these, about the ARPA funds and the opportunities. And we really wanted to maximize all of those other funds coming in, like FEMA, right, and CARES Act. But I guess what I would say is that I'm glad that we kind of have this next phase, and we're kind of not slowing down our spending, but we want to be really thoughtful about taking a look at the landscape. What are those pieces where we are able to leverage that flexibility piece and able to, figure out what needs that need to be addressed that we wouldn't be able to go through our regular process. And it is hard to meet the needs of all the people in the community, as I'm sure I'm just speaking to like everyone who understands all of this information anyways, but I was almost overwhelmed with, I think, the amount of power or whatever that we had in the approval process for ARPA, because there was just so much autonomy for the towns, and just the amount of money coming in was I just wasn't, it's nothing I experienced before.
I will say, I think for me, the thing we did the best, the most successful piece of this was actually the transparency piece. All of our meetings were public. All of the documents we referenced were public. All the grants were public for people to see. Our spreadsheet with scoring and comments was public for people to see. And this is, I think, hard to do. And I think, we really made an effort. We actually held a public meeting for public input when we were near final. So we had a near final spreadsheet, and we had a meeting just to hear from people with a goal of actually, sometimes you just do that. It's a little bit of lip service, let's be honest, right? Oh, we had a public meeting, but we really actually listened. I'm not just saying this to be facetious. And we had a follow-up meeting where we made changes to that spreadsheet based on what we heard from the public input. And that to me was a really powerful moment, because we really were open as a committee to say our job is to do what the community wants. And we were able to take that input, even though we'd all gotten, you get a little married to the proposals that you decided are the ones that should be funded. So I thought that was a really successful piece of our committee. Again, I think there's a lot to work on. I appreciate the honesty of the committee I work with, because you can't see these things by yourself. You need other people to speak up, and you need to create a space where everyone feels like they can speak up and be heard. And so I really appreciate the work of the committee in a way. I'm on like 7 committees. I don't know how many committees you're on, Anita. It's mind-boggling. It's my most time-consuming, and also, sorry to the other committees, my favorite committee. Because also you really you get to see the impact in ways you don't with a lot of the other work we do.
All right, excellent. Well, I just want to appreciate both of you, your leadership locally and everything that you've shared with us today. I think it's so helpful to understand, both what you've experienced as a leader in your communities respectively, and just sort of the challenges of working with this new amazing funding source, but also, building it and flying it at the same time is not easy. And we all respect the work that you're doing and what you are trying to accomplish through your efforts. So thank you so much for your leadership and for sharing with us today. I'm going to turn it over to Erica now.
Thanks, Jenny, and thanks everyone for your wisdom, your advice along the way. This has been really excellent to hear everyone's perspective. So now that we've heard from the inside, kind of thinking about how towns, municipalities are going about this federal funding, now we want to shift our attention to more community perspectives about how local groups, advocates, activists, and community residents are thinking about these federal funds. So I'm going to pitch it over to my colleague, Ben Wood. Ben, you want to give a quick introduction, and then our panelists can introduce themselves before we jump into the questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Erica, and thank you, everybody so far. This has been really great. My name is Ben Wood. These are he series pronouns. I'm with Health Resources in Action, and I have been part of our ARPA team over the past year. And as Erica said, we're going to hear from a great group of community folks who really do spend a lot of time bridging the space between community and municipal officials, and are really trying to do the hard work of elevating community voice. Actually, one thing that I heard in Senator Markey's very amazing and powerful video remarks was that he said that we should be seeing these federal resources with all the same moral imperative of the Civil Rights Act, which is like, that's a challenge and amazing opportunity. And I think that the panelists we're about to hear from really share that sentiment and are trying to live that out on a daily basis. So I'm gonna ask each person to introduce themselves really briefly. Introduce yourself, your organization, or the community you sort of come from and represent, however you want to frame an introduction to yourself. So I'm going to start with Casey.
Hi, everyone. So great to be here. I'm Casey Burns. I'm the director of the Coalition for Healthy Greater Worcester, and I have also was a member of a coalition of community partners that came together over COVID called Worcester Together that worked on our COVID response, and through funding, community partners, and collaboration, and that really led us to the opportunity to be involved in as an advisory capacity in the ARPA distribution process for our city.
Thanks, Casey. Next person down on my screen is Kathy.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Kathy, and I'm from in Lowell, Massachusetts. I'm the executive director of Merrimack Valley Housing Partnership. I'm also part of many nonprofit boards here, and I'm just glad to be here.
Great. And Gina, you're up next.
Hi, everyone. Good to see you. Gina Platanino, she, her, ella pronouns. I'm here in the capacity of working with the coalition that Casey mentioned in terms of providing an advisory role in the city of Worcester.
And Jeff.
Hey everyone, Jeff Foster. I use he, him. I'm the executive director at Common Cause Massachusetts. We're a statewide organization with over 20,000 members, really working on strengthening democracy and making government more transparent and accessible. Common Cause was named to the statewide ARPA Oversight and Equity panel, likely to help champion transparency and access. But I also bring over 15 years experience of equity-driven positive youth development experience related to policy and budget advocacy. And I got to do a lot of that work in my hometown of Lowell. So I'll be bringing both perspectives into today's discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you all for being here. So Kathy, I'm going to start with you and just want to know a little bit about how the Merrimack Valley Housing Partnership, how do you think about advocacy and how do you make the issues and needs of your community and the issues and things that you need to be represented known to town officials?
Well, a lot of what I've been trying to do since, we heard about the allocations of ARPA funds is reaching out to our city officials, one by one, advocating for housing justice, looking at different ways that we could try to create new programs so that we can create more housing in our city and make sure that we're taking care of not just home ownership, even though that's what our organization is focused on, but also in rental units and keeping people that are in the process of being either evicted, and how can we advocate for those individuals as well. Another part of two nonprofits where the chair of, and what we're doing, one is the Center for Hope and Healing, which we advocate for sexual violence, mental health issues, equitable for BIPOC individuals. We have different resources with Acre Family Childcare, where that's early education. So advocating for all of those avenues in regards to ARPA funding is something that I always have different hats on. So it's housing, it's early childcare development, it's mental health issues, sexual violence. How can we advocate for all of these things? So it's not just one particular thing, it's so many things that we're trying to reach out and just make sure that our city officials and our council understand that we're looking for innovative ways and to open up their, sometimes they're just thinking like I heard someone earlier said, and I can't remember who it was, that you get married to certain applications and certain things. And we're trying to open the horizon to make sure that they can look at, this is something new for everyone. Like everyone has said here that, we really don't know how we're going to allocate these funds. What are we doing? It's a learning process, right? No one really expected this to happen. So we're trying to just work closely with our city officials to make sure that we give them those ideas. I mean, partnerships is what we need to do. And the fact that they listen to us is the most important thing, that they're actually opening up to partnerships with the nonprofit communities and other agencies as well.
Thank you so much. What are some specific strategies, like some of the tactical stuff that you go through and you think about as you're trying to make those issues known to town officials that you think other folks could hear from and learn from?
So, I mean, one of the things that, I have proposed to the city in regards to allocations for, like, say, creating generational wealth for first-time home buyers using ARPA funds, because as they said, there's a quotation that, they could be flexible and, specifically creating a program that's helping people buy down the interest rate in order to be able to purchase in this market, because most people, especially people of color, are priced out of this market because of the high interest rate and the high cost of the housing right now. So that's one thing specifically that, you know, I've been working closely with the city, or we have been working closely with the city for. Another thing is, when we teach our home buyer classes, a lot of these people are renters, so we're giving them the resources that this funding out there, that they need to really pay attention to what's going on with the ARPA funding. And just making sure that we're advocating at each class that we teach, to just make sure that we tell our community members that these funds are available. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks, Kathy. Gina, I'm going to pass it to you now and want to really sort of dig into this imperative that these federal resources are really designed to benefit folks who have been most disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, but historically too, right? And so question is, how do you center people who have lived experience dealing with the issues that need to be addressed in advocacy efforts?
Absolutely. And I'll start off with describing like even who's at this table and even who I am, right? There's a privilege attached to the titles that we bring in. There's a privilege to be able to volunteer a lot of time, right? Because we all did this out of we're community folks that volunteer, but many of us are in executive positions where we work remotely, where we can do and multitask and do many other things. So as this is happening, it's very important to be aware of who's missing from the table and who may not have the bandwidth or capacity or other issues that they cannot participate. And we saw this quite a lot in the city of Worcester, is the second largest city of New England. Our Latino population, Latinx Latine population was, you know, affected at 6 times the rate that our Black population. And Casey and I did a lot of health equity work. And seeing again, as we looked around the room, like, oh yikes, I'm the only person that looks like me, but I'm here because of my titles and so on. How do we stop that from happening? And really calling that out in every space. I just want to make everyone aware that there are people here. And then also, as we were having these discussions, saying and putting in the broad picture that at the end of the day, all of us were working remotely, that our lives hadn't changed necessarily negatively, but positively, because it just made our lives a lot easier, which is something that people don't want to talk about instead of the privileges that decisions allow you to. So when we talked about working with people with lived expertise, my background is dealing in the anti-hunger world. And hunger, like, is the one most visible determinant of sort of like what people see. So working with our food banks, for our community food pantries, working with the childcare workers who are seeing this firsthand and saying, what time works for you? I appreciate right now, for example, that there's multiple languages. That is ESL, ASL, talking, you know, I appreciate all of that because those are things that we really took into consideration and working with the communities. But I will note something and flag something with these communities is that even with all the outreach we did, we still missed a lot of people. Because the fact that people are working 2 to 3 jobs, that they're not necessarily logged in these works or these task forces that they have, or some of them just didn't even have the time. One of the things that we really pushed for was compensating individuals and treating them as consultants, because that's what they are in terms of the expertise. And not only that, but also ensure that it wasn't just their story we were borrowing, but they were actually part of the policy and the situations that they were trying to address. Because sometimes in some spaces, we just want to hear like, oh, how hard is this for you? Yes, we know this is hard. We hear you, but tell us your ideas. Because sometimes the second part and working with individuals around what their ideas may not necessarily match what our ideas or our policies are. So being extremely flexible around that. But I think the main thing is, again, the dignity part, the respect part, and allowing the space and have the flexibility that works with people. We had people calling on lunch break. We had people calling at different hours of the night because 9 to 5, they're working, right? We can jump in different things. So thinking about that and being incredibly intentional. And I think one of the best things that really helped was having already community connections on the ground with people who already were connected. But again, having the flexibility and you know, the privilege to be able to engage in these spaces so that people can trust you and they know that you're going to protect their story, but more importantly, creating a space where they can advocate and raise the issues that they themselves have been affected on their own, without sort of the patronizing hand holding that sometimes comes, unintentionally from advocates.
That's super helpful, Gina. Can you give us a concrete example of how you have seen town officials trying to live up to that goal of actually showing dignity and respect, and maybe an example of when you think things haven't gone so well?
Well, I should say that that's the goal. Everything we talked about is the goal, and we work really closely in terms of town. It's difficult. I have such a respect for town officials because they have to deal with a lot of red tape, and a lot of the concepts that we talk are very new. I will say that they are trying, and sometimes they are successful and sometimes not. But I would say, then, to answer that, it is such an intentional, constant process that it can be overnight. So we had some listening sessions. We really pushed for listening sessions in the city of Worcester. And one of the main things that we worked on was facilitation. Because the facilitation was done from people who were just, in their suits, and they all spoke the same language and saying, like, reading it well. And we're towards the end, we finally told that Casey, the director of the coalition, she has trained facilitators on equity, belonging, diversity, and who could speak the language of different people and people groups. And towards the end, I would say that was a perfect no, but it was successful in the way that instead of people just like reading off, they were able to engage with the community members who were sitting at the table. I know on our end, to add behind that we did offer stipends, that we did offer babysitting. And by we, I mean the community as a whole. It was a large community effort so that individuals could go and participate. But it took quite a lot to get to that point and to say, like, that's why you need to do this, and providing all of those resources. And I just want to clarify that it's such a way of thinking. It's like a muscle that you constantly have to work on. And if you haven't, it's really new for some individuals. Sometimes within city leadership, it's not that they intentionally want to leave things out, but that still causes harm, even if we're not intentionally doing things. So I would say the good example is that the willingness to understand, like, oh, we didn't know we were incorrectly facilitating this. I'm like, yeah, it's pretty bad. This is the way you should do it, and allowing the coalition to come in with experts and say, like, we're going to facilitate this. And that's a great example, again, just that it took so long to get to that point, and and just thinking that you can learn sort of equity in like a 1-hour training versus an ongoing learning.
Yeah. Thank you so much for calling out some of those, like, quote unquote soft skills, like around facilitating a meeting, as critical components that can really make or break a process. Jeff, gonna pass it over. Oh, yes, Casey, you want to jump in?
Oh, I was just going to say really quickly, I think Gina really well encapsulated it, but I think it's been helpful for me to, like, thinking of this process and trying as much as possible, even though it's, I don't know, somewhat against human nature, at least mine, to enter into it, is like trying to really keep in the forefront that we are, if we think of the goal of this funds to disrupt the systems that have caused the harm and created the disparities in the first place, that we are going to be running against some really well-oiled gears or machines. And so we have to anticipate there's going to be lots of layers of challenges and ways of doing business that are ingrained in the way people are used to doing things, their expectations of power, their relationships, those dynamics, and that is complicated to change. And I think that that's been helpful thinking about it. But I thought we said we're in this for equity together. Why are we not speaking the same language? It's like, well, this is like, human behavior takes a lot of work to be as grained as it does, and it's going to take that it's going to take a complicated system to dismantle that. And so that's been just a helpful framework in me in kind of keeping the momentum.
Yeah, thanks, Casey. And actually, I do now want to pass it to Jeff, because I think that Jeff's organization is actually the type of organization that is trying to understand how best to work with and maybe against, in some cases, the well-oiled machine that can create barriers to equitable processes. So Jeff, how about just giving us a little bit about, from your experiences, some of the challenges and opportunities and lessons learned that you've come across when advocating for federal resources?
Yeah, so again, thanks so much for having me. And it's already been said, actually, Casey, thanks. That was a really good setup here. But I mean, we just have to recognize there's a huge gap that exists and has long existed between directly and disproportionately impacted folks and communities and the spaces where policies and budgets are decided. That could be local, that could be state, and that could be at the federal level. And it's in these very gaps in civic engagement and community power that have resulted in these generational, disproportionate harm that is certainly clear in a lot of the communities I know in this part of Massachusetts, but also statewide. I'm certainly an optimist. I think that there's many really great success stories that have already come out of public engagement around ARPA. But I also think there's a lot more that could be done, not just at the local level, but at the state level. I will say, to only view ARPA funds as like a one-time budget boost is a missed opportunity to innovate, all across the board. And I think there's different places that we can look at for innovation. But ultimately, I think what's really important here is that when we think about the use of ARPA as a one-time investment in infrastructure, that we, extend that to thinking about what's the democracy infrastructure? What's going on? What is there accessibility things that could be done right now? One huge win that came out of the pandemic, and many of you probably have personal experience with this, was that initially as a necessity, we expanded the virtual options for folks to engage in public meeting processes, right? We all of a sudden started having Zoom in our town halls and city halls. This is a huge win, and it was and is right now temporary. So we're really excited about that possibly being made permanent, not just because it was important during a pandemic, but I mean, it increased access across the board. And so to have something like that be permanent moving forward would be a real win for democracy. And I will say, if there are costs related to making that change for logistically, be a great use of ARPA funds. I'll say another thing too, and this is a little bit of a total change, but and really in the weeds, but I think there could be a lot more done to innovate and champion equity in like the RFP and contract making process. It seems boring and turns a lot of people off, but I'm sure a lot of you who are day-to-day familiar with a lot of this know that that is a canvas on which we could do some seriously powerful innovation. We can think big, we can think systemically, but we can also make sure that equity is centered. Everything from the bid to the award and the contract. So state government can play a role in that. Local government can play a role in that, especially if they're pass-through dollars. As Heath actually mentioned at the outset, some of these innovations that can be tested now through the ARPA process could have huge positive impacts on future efforts to address public health disparities across the board. I will just mention that there's a specific example of this working really, really well in Massachusetts in the past. It was actually through the Department of Public Health and the Executive Office of Health and Human Services when they used a public health approach to address gun violence. And so the legislature invested all this new money and to address those issues, but it was really the state agencies who took that extra step to build equity metrics into their requirements. It helped ensure that the funding that went out into the communities brought people together. Some of the requirements were that there had to be kind of a municipality that led in applying for the funds, but they had to bring together service providers. And so, ensuring that from the bid standpoint, community really hard to already be thinking about coalitions and who was going to be at the table. I mean, that's stuff that really had a positive impact on the outcomes of the program. And then lastly, I'll just say, the way that we think about how ARPA is distributed and the way that we're bringing folks to the table. I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge what Congresswoman Presley says so well, right? And that is that people closest to the pain should be closest to the power. And that's also been, I think, already adapted to say people closest to the pain should be closest to the policy making. And that's the same for the budget. That's the same for the budget. And so, if we're really going to get serious about making sure that the money is having an equitable impact, we have to recognize that we have policy expertise in the lived experience of the folks that Gina was lifting up. And so I think local governments could be really helpful leaders moving forward. In closing, there's a ton of money that's still to be spent, but a lot of it will be coming our way now from the state. And so, I don't know if municipalities are going to get more money from the state that's discretionary, but a lot of the money is discretionary from the state legislature. So I do think, municipalities shouldn't shy away from the work there either, right? You could be conveners, you could bring together community organizations and directly impacted folks with the state delegation to sit down and help kind of frame and shape what the municipality thinks are the best uses for those state funding to come. So I think there's still a lot of opportunity for y'all to do some leadership work. And it's really at the service of investing in our democracy and removing barriers to participation.
Jeff, thank you so much for laying out opportunities and challenges at multiple different levels and making it down to that sort of even that tactical level around RFPs and those types of processes. I want to come back to you, Kathy, and ask how you see some of this actually playing out in Lowell to give a sort of a much more community granular level example and experience. And want to know in particular, what are some of the supports that an organization like yours needs from town officials to best be positioned to take advantage of these types of resources and to do what you feel like is necessary for the populations that you serve?
All right, let me see how I do with this question. I really think we had 3 listening sessions. They have a plan mapped out, a lot, and it's on their website, which is great. But actually, one thing that we run into is kind of what I said earlier. It's listening to the people that are closest to the work, like Gina said, and everyone else has echoed here as well. In regards to what is done next, I look at the outline that our city here in the city of Lowell, and the town officials know that I don't have any issues speaking my mind. So, some of the things that I see where the funding is going to, I wish that they would relook at the structure that they put in place thus far and kind of, really open that up to an equitable lens, because some of the things I think are not what what they intended these funds to be, in my opinion. So I think that we need to have more listening sessions, but listening sessions where they actually listen.
Thank you, Kathy. Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. And we're gonna wrap it up. We're running out of time here, but I want to ask each of you, and Kathy, I think you just did this actually. If you had one piece of advice for town officials that you were working with, what would that advice be? And you could just sum it up as a word, one sentence, one real brief piece of advice. And maybe I'll start with Gina.
I'll echo what, listening to our people with lived expertise and these policies, and also listen, because you're already listening to the chamber. You're listening to big organizations with big interest, right? But they don't necessarily represent the community and the voters and the individuals most affected who have been not part of the system. So not just listening, but also creating avenues where they can participate. Look at how you allow for people to participate in commissions, in your boards, across, and in these committees, because there are various levels there of barriers that need to be addressed.
Wonderful. Jeff, what's your one piece of advice? Real quick.
Yeah, I'd say expand the constituency outside of folks who turn out to vote every municipal election. I think that's a really direct way of disrupting the power structure, and know that there are barriers that prevent those voices from being at the table. And perhaps this is a really good time for you to help facilitate them into the discussion.
Wonderful. Casey, how about you?
I would say value resources in your community that could help make your process better.
All right. And Kathy, last word.
Last word, call them in. Call them in. Call each and everyone in and make them stand by their word.
All right.
That's it.
Love it. Wonderful. Thank you all so much for taking the time to be here and sharing your vast experience and your perspectives. Pass it over to Jenny to close us out.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much. That was an amazing panel. And I just want to say that, community engagement is really central to what we wanted to get out of this session, both from our municipal officials and then, of course, from all of these community partners working statewide and at the local level. And we have so much to learn from people who are actually closest to the pain, but not just to hear them talking or give them opportunities to speak, but to actually listen, process that, and make policy change, funding change happen. And that's what this whole session was about. So that really is wonderful from the beginning to the end. And so I want to just say in closing that there are many upcoming opportunities that our organization, Northern Middlesex Council of Governments, has going on that directly relate to change that we're looking forward to happening in this region, which includes opportunities working on a regional transportation plan that are on the screen here, some upcoming focus groups, a survey that is open right now, and then on the next slide, some opportunities for direct technical assistance from people who are here at the agency who want to work with you on accessing these federal funding opportunities for everything from energy assistance in your community to housing, economic development, transportation, school resources, so many different opportunities which were outlined by the senator in the beginning. Also, we'll be working on a regional housing strategy in the future, which I think will help us to develop a broader vision around equity and growth in our region. So next slide. With that, I want to say thank you. I definitely want to, again, thank everybody who's voiced everything to us today, and definitely to our partners at Health Resources in Action, Ben and Erica, and the whole team, all of our people who are helping us today, including our interpreters, and then also, again, to all of my staff here at Northern Middlesex Council of Governments for all of their support, both to get us here today and in carrying this forward, as well as the council for their support for this webinar today. So with that, I will say thank you again and have a great afternoon.